Waterford emerged from the wreckage of 1650 slowly. For decades it remained a city under restraint, its Catholic merchants taxed, its churches converted, its civic life hollowed out. But cities rebuild. And by the early 18th century, something unexpected was happening on the banks of the River Suir. The medieval walls that had defined Waterford for 5 centuries were pulled down at the start of the 1700s. In their place rose a new city, wider streets, Georgian terraces, a mall lined with limestone. Catholic, Anglican, Quaker and HYU Gounod families rebuilt Waterford together, each community contributing to a prosperity that transcended religious division. One man shaped the skyline more than any other. Born in Waterford in 1712, the architect who would define the city's Georgian character had the unusual distinction of designing both its Protestant and Catholic cathedrals. His Protestant cathedral was described by one architectural historian as the finest 18th century ecclesiastical building in Ireland. His Catholic cathedral, the first post-Reformation Catholic cathedral built in Ireland, was still under construction when he died in 1796, having risen too early one morning to inspect the work and fallen asleep on the unfinished floor, catching a chill from which he never recovered. By the time he died, he had transformed a medieval city into a European one. In 1783, the same year that construction began on that Catholic cathedral, 2 Quaker merchants standing beside the River Suir had a different kind of vision. They wanted to make the finest glass in Europe. They petitioned Parliament for aid, invested £10,000 and built a glass house on Merchants Quay. They recruited skilled craftsmen from England, set them to work with lead and fire and patience, and within a year were producing crystal of such clarity and brilliance that it found its way to the tables of kings. Waterford glass reached the courts of Europe, the markets of America, and the homes of the wealthy across the world. But the industry that had made the city's name was never safe. Excise taxes on Irish glass, introduced in the early 19th century, slowly strangled it. By 1851, after 68 years of continuous production, the glasshouse closed. The craftsmen scattered, the moulds went cold. For nearly a century, Waterford Crystal was a memory. The Great Famine arrived in Ireland in 1845. In Waterford, as across the country, the potato crop failed, and then failed again. The county's population fell from nearly 200,000 to under 160,000 in a decade. The workhouses at Waterford and Dungarvan were overwhelmed. Ships left the quay carrying people who would never return. But Waterford in the 1840s also gave Ireland something that would outlast the famine. A young man born on the Mall, the son of a wealthy Catholic merchant, had travelled to Paris and returned carrying a gift: 3 lengths of French silk in green, white and orange. On the 7th of March 1848, he stood in the city of his birth and raised that flag for the first time in public. He described the white in the centre as a lasting truce between the orange and the green. The flag did not become Ireland's national symbol for another 90 years, but it began here, on the quays of Waterford. That same young man was later transported for his part in the failed rebellion of 1848. He escaped to America, became a general in the Union Army during the Civil War, and died as the acting governor of Montana Territory. His city never forgot him. The decades that followed the famine were decades of slow pressure. The Land League, the fight for tenant rights, the long campaign for Home Rule, that consumed a generation of Irish political life. Waterford sent its voices to Westminster and its men to the fields. When the War of Independence finally broke out in 1919, Waterford's flying column was in the field under a commander from West Waterford. Ambushes on British patrols, attacks on barracks. Martial law declared across the county in January 1921. When the truce came in July 1921 and the treaty was signed in December, Waterford's British garrison packed its weapons and left. But the treaty divided Ireland as surely as any invasion. Waterford became a stronghold of the anti-treaty side, the eastern pillar of what Republicans called the Munster Republic. In July 1922, Free State troops arrived from Kilkenny with an 18-pound artillery piece. They placed it on the hill north of the river, overlooking the city that had once repelled every army that came against it. The shells fell on the barracks and the jail. Within days, Waterford fell to Irishmen firing on Irishmen. For the first time since Cromwell, artillery had decided the city's fate. Europe in 1947 was still pulling itself from the ruins of a Second World War. In Waterford, a Czech glassmaker who had fled the communist takeover of his country arrived with a mission: to rebuild what had been lost nearly a century before. He had studied the old pattern books preserved in the National Museum in Dublin. He brought with him a fellow craftsman as chief designer. Together they built a small factory in the suburbs of the city and began again. The first glass was blown in September 1947. Within a decade, Waterford Crystal was not just alive, it was dominant. By the 1970s, the factory employed 3,000 people in a city of 46,000. Its chandeliers hung in Westminster Abbey, Windsor Castle, and the Kennedy Center in Washington. The Lismore pattern, designed in 1952, its diamond cuts inspired by the towers of a castle in County Waterford, became the world's best-selling crystal stemware. In 1999, more than 1 billion people watched a Waterford crystal ball descend over Times Square to mark the new millennium. The factory closed again in 2009, a casualty of the global financial crisis. It reopened the following year in the heart of the city, closer to the quay where the Penrose brothers had first fired their furnaces 226 years before. Waterford today is Ireland's oldest city. Its Viking streets still run below the Georgian facades. Reginald's Tower still stands at the edge of the quay 1,000 years after the first stone was laid. The medieval vestments hidden beneath the cathedral floor in 1650 are on display in the museum 2 minutes' walk from where they were buried. The city has been taken twice in its history, by Strongbow in 1170 and by Irishmen in 1922. Every other army that came left empty-handed. The city of Waterford remains.